In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Despite what Chris might say, spring is here. Chris, as you may know, for those devoted followers, Chris is a big fan of winter time. And spring has kind of, given us a scare. It's been cold. It was hot for a couple days and it was cold. And then we had a crazy hailstorm a couple nights ago. Woke up my whole family. At any rate, the weather today is beautiful here in downtown West Chicago, where you may hear people chatting about having fun. It's Blooming Fest in West Chicago, the town's festival, and so it's actually going to be ending in a couple hours. So you might hear little kids screaming as they're going by, but I think I can promise no fire trucks on today's episode. Of course, these are sort of just like Easter eggs for some of our hardcore followers. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about some of the disputed Pauline letters, but first, before we jump into our discussion today, I have a couple announcements. First, Defenders Media is hiring. We are looking to hire a communications and administrative assistant. Chris here has this up. You can see I'm logged into WordPress. We make WordPress sites here, but here's the description. If you live in the Chicagoland area and you want to join our team, please check out defendersmedia.com/jobs. Some of the duties for this position include helping out Veracity Hill on a regular basis with scheduling guests and coming up with the bio and things like that. Just saves us a little bit of time. But also some social media work. It would be great to have someone help build this program out with us and build other ministries as well with Defenders Media. So we would love to have you apply if you're interested and local. I have considered letting the job be remote, some of the tasks that would have to change. So if you are interested in helping out Defenders on a regular basis, 10 to 20 hours a week, it's flexible. I want to see if we can find someone who's really good at what they want to do here for us. So would love to have you. All right, last week we were unable to get to one of the listener questions that came in. So without further ado, oh, that sound, that jingle. Man, I love that jingle. If you want me to play that jingle more frequently on the show, would you consider sending in a question? There are a couple ways you can do that. Just email me, kurt@veracityhill.com. You can also join our texting plan. Text word Veracity to 555-888, and you'll join our list from time to time. I send a text message out letting folks know what the upcoming guest is, or a quick reminder to tune in to our program. And so, totally free for you. But if you want to, send a question in, I can receive that this way. So here's the question this week. It deals with the realm of ethics. It's a bit more of a technical question, but it shouldn't be too far from our understanding. So the question is about how moral truths can exist. So I'm loading up the question here, if I can pull it up. It's from Billy Gambone or Gamboni. I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, Billy, but thank you for your question. Here it is. He asks, how would you respond to a non-theist who claims that objective moral facts and obligations are just axiomatically brute facts? So, he continues, that have no need for explanation. I was just curious, since you're well-read in ethics, I want to see your point of view. Thank you, Billy. All right, some technical terms here, axiomatically brute facts. Basically, what he's saying is, what happens if an atheist comes up to you and says, well, objective morals just exist. They just are. So I think there are some things that are brute facts, but what I would be concerned about with regard to morality is what binds these alleged brute facts to our actions. Maybe, hypothetically, they exist out there in the ethos somewhere. I mean, moral facts are immaterial, so it's not like you can discover them by performing a science experiment. But what binds these alleged objective ethical truths to the way we behave today? There doesn't seem to be anything that would do that. And so I would certainly think there's a better explanation for how objective morality exists, and that's because they exist in the nature and what we receive as through the commands of God. So I hold to sort of a modified divine command theory approach to ethics. But Billy, I think that's the way I would respond and say, what would bind these alleged brute facts? There's nothing that actually brings that connection between these propositional truths and us forming our behavior to fit with them. There's nothing there. There's no obligation that actually exists there. So a good question. Of course, there's all sorts of literature on that, and there are philosophers debating it. If you want to follow up, I'd be happy to give you some further resources. All right, so before getting into our discussion today, I do want to say this. If you are interested in learning more from Christian thinkers on what they have to say about ethics and morality, well, there's a great book out there right now. Recently came out by Kenneth Samples. Many of us pick up Christian theology and history in a piecemeal way, making it difficult to understand its significance. But in his new book, Classic Christian Thinkers, Philosopher and Theologian, Kenneth Samples offers a masterful summary of the lives of Christianity's greatest defenders. The history of these 9 timeless truth seekers overflows from the pages of the Bible into history itself. Take a step toward a richer faith by visiting reasons.org/veracity and order your copy of Classic Christian Thinkers today. So again, reasons.org/veracity, and you can pick up Ken Samples' recent book. And if you hadn't had the chance yet, it was probably about a month or so ago now, we had him on the program to talk about that book. So I want to encourage you to go and listen to that and hear about the great guys that are out there in Christian history. Many people we can learn from. All right, so without further ado, our guest today is this is his 3rd time on the program. And he is a prolific debater. He is well-read. He does theology and community, and that's one thing I appreciate about him. And while I don't agree with him on many things, he and I are spiritual brothers, certainly in Christ, and spiritual brothers of the ecumenical sort. And I have said it publicly that he has spanked a number of people on the side I view. Chris Date, thank you for joining us on the program today.
As usual, it's my honor and pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, let me also say this. While I say there are many things we disagree on, there are, of course, more things we do agree on.
Sure.
I don't want to give the picture there, but I could think of 2 main things we presently disagree on. It would be you're Reformed, and also your view on the doctrine of hell. But I think those are probably the 2 biggest things.
I'll add one more that's relevant since you just read an advert from Reasons to Believe. I'm also not an old Earth creationist.
Yes.
I'm a young Earth creationist. So there's another one.
That's right. That is another one. That's right. Yeah, you remembered that. Good. So that's 3 things. So, but of course, there are many more things we do agree upon.
That's right. Amen.
Yes. And so, like I said, I mean, you have look, and I say this because it happened to me. So when I was in college, this guy, Nick, you know Nick.
Nick Quint?
Yeah. He emailed me saying, hey, Kurt, would you put a blog post together explaining, it was something vague, like explain the doctrine of hell or, And I thought, oh, okay, he's just, I'm thinking popular audience, something like this. He said, oh, yeah, I'm going to get some other blog posts together. And like, I feel, and I've told this to Nick, I feel like I was set up. I mean... So I just got a rightful spanking because I just didn't come prepared. Now, that said, there are people in the theological community who are aware of what they're getting into, as in like a formal debate with you. And I'm happy to say this. You just come very prepared. And many folks on the traditionalist side, I'm not sure if you like that label. I forget what
I think traditionalist is fine because we conditionalists don't use that word to mean that believers in eternal torment only believe in it and defend it because it's traditional. We're just saying it is the traditional view. That's all.
Right. Yeah. So traditionalists go in and they're just, for whatever reason, they just aren't prepared. So like, if ever I get around to debating you, I know I'm going to have to listen to any material you've got out there or read material and just come ready because Chris is an avid debater. I mean, he packs in 20 minutes of material in 10 minutes. He's a very fast speaker. So, but on today's program, hopefully we're just going to be shooting the breeze here, talking about the disputed Pauline letters, and specifically we'll probably get into the pastorals. So let me first ask this, Chris. When we talk about the disputed Pauline letters, what does that mean? What does that refer to?
Yeah, so of the 13 letters in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul, scholars sort of categorize them into two categories. One is the undisputed Pauline letters. These are the letters that all scholars, or virtually all scholars, agree were written by Paul, both on conservative ends of the spectrum and on the liberal end of the spectrum. And there are 7 of the 13. So we're talking Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon, or however you want to pronounce that.
Sure.
The other 6, however, we're talking Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, as well as the 3 pastorals, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. Those are called disputed because some percentage or another of of biblical scholarship disputes that they are, in fact, Pauline. And within those 6 disputed letters, there's still a further subcategorization. There are 2 of them that the scholarship is kind of evenly divided over whether they're authentic or not. So about 50% of scholars think that Colossians and 2 Thessalonians are truly Pauline, whereas 50% think otherwise. But when it comes to Ephesians and the pastorals, something like 80% or more of biblical scholarship would say that those are not truly Pauline.
Okay, and so before even getting into the arguments specifically, what would be a general overview of why they think it's not written by Paul himself?
Yeah, so there are a number of features that the disputed letters exhibit that critics claim suggest that the letters aren't actually Pauline. So, for example, one of the things, and this is particularly the case with the pastorals, is it's argued that the chronology of certain events referred to in the pastorals doesn't line up with the chronology in Acts or in the undisputed letters. Vocabulary of the disputed letters is sometimes alleged to be markedly different from the vocabulary that Paul uses in the letters acknowledged to be truly Pauline. And the content, the theology, the instructions, things like that of the disputed Pauline letters are argued to be in certain significant ways different from the content of other books, the meanings of words, the theological concepts, things like that. So these are kind of the 3 biggest reasons I've found. There are probably others, but these I think are the 3 most common.
Okay, yeah. So you get folks like Bart Ehrman who would say that these things are not authentic to Paul, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things would be like vocabulary word choice, even, and analyzing that between, if we're looking at just the pastorals from within this group. So what is it about vocabulary words? Because they think Paul doesn't have certain words in his vocabulary and can't, write letters later in his life about that? What's the thinking there?
Yeah, well, so to give you a specific example, there's something like 850 individual words used in the pastorals. And of those 850, over a third of them don't appear anywhere else in Paul's letters. And what's more, there's a higher concentration in the pastorals of hapax legomena, the words that only appear once in the New Testament. There's a higher concentration of those in the pastorals than there is in the other Pauline letters. So that's one aspect. That the language is just argued to be so unique, so different from and set apart from the language that Paul uses elsewhere. Now, I don't think that they would say Paul couldn't use different language from congregation to congregation, but they would cite this as one part of the category of vocabulary that points to their being pseudonymous or pseudepigraphal.
Yeah. So when you say that these letters have one third of the words don't appear in any other letters, and that it's a higher concentration. So what you're saying is, like, let's take 1 Corinthians, which the vast majority of scholars say is Pauline. What percentage of the words there are not used anywhere else? I mean, I don't know. You probably don't know off the top of your head, but is, ballpark like 10% as opposed to 33%?
Yeah, I don't even have that ballpark, but here's what I do have. Something of the 2,500 distinct words attributed to Paul throughout the New Testament, around half of them appear in just one letter or another.
Yeah, right.
Right. So this is much ado about nothing. The evidence, I think, suggests that Paul simply enjoys using a variety of vocabulary at different times and for different recipients. And look, I've been writing now for something like 10 years, or maybe 5 years, depending upon whether you want to go back to before I started my higher education. And just in that 5-year span of time, you're going to see quite a change and a development in the vocabulary I use, not only because of changing conditions and changing audiences, but just also because I'm growing and learning and maturing. And no doubt Paul continued to learn and grow and develop his understanding of Christian doctrine and stuff and pass it on. And so you would expect that he would choose different language for different audiences.
Yeah. One of the thoughts out there is for why it's a late letter, it's pseudepigraphal, is because you see some of the church fathers using that language. And so some scholars think, that means it was probably written in the 2nd century. But of course, that's a non sequitur, right? That doesn't follow. It very well could be the case that the church fathers had read the pastorals and so then apply the same vocabulary words.
Yeah, that's right. And what's more, of the vocabulary of the pastorals, although it is more popular in the 2nd century, which, as you pointed out, would be expected, nevertheless, over 90% of that vocabulary can be found in extra-biblical writings dating to before 50 A.D. So there's nothing in the pastorals in terms of vocabulary that doesn't fit well within a 1st century context.
So some people might think we're just jumping right into this here. Let me
it's your
ask,
fault, not mine.
let me ask you. Why is this important for average churchgoers to be aware of the authenticity of the letter?
Well, I suppose it depends on what the individual person, whether or not the individual person has a problem accepting as canonical and as authoritative a letter attributed to Paul that wasn't actually written by Paul. Some, and I don't think this is as much true of lay Christians as much as it is of scholars, but at least scholars, many of them are willing to treat letters that are attributed to Paul but they don't think are written by Paul as authoritative because they're canonical. They were deemed authoritative by the early church, even if the early church was wrong about who wrote them. But I think that for most lay Christians, the idea that a document meant to exhort and instruct Christians could truly be authentic and Holy Spirit inspired, God breathed, 2 Timothy 3:16. I think a lot of us have a trouble believing that Christian scripture could actually lie, in the sense that it is purported to be written by somebody who it's not actually written by. So my concern with this issue, the issue of the Pauline authorship of the letters of the New Testament, is that I think a lot of Christians are going to have their faith shaken if they are convinced that the evidence is good for disbelieving in the authenticity of certain Pauline letters.
You said that a lot of people would feel uncomfortable. But would we have to be? Would we have to feel uncomfortable if, say, 2 Timothy weren't actually written by Paul?
Being somebody who believes Paul did write 2 Timothy, I'm not so sure I can answer that question effectively. I suppose a persuasive philosophical case could be made or theological case could be made that no, we don't have to, in order to treat it as authoritative. But I'm not as concerned with what we must or mustn't do. I'm more concerned with the effect it's going to have on the church at large.
Well, so let's take the book of Hebrews. No one knows the author.
That's right.
Now, maybe that's a little different because it's different than saying, Paul to Timothy.
Right.
So one is just sort of anonymous, whereas the other one claims to be written by a person. So maybe that's what that difference is. But nonetheless, I mean, even an anonymous text still has spiritual value. We can see it's clearly written by someone who is a Christian in, we would say the 1st century, and within, 1 degree of the apostles. So that it would qualify to remain in the canon seems like a good candidate.
Yeah, but like you said, I think the big difference between Hebrews and the disputed Pauline letters is that, I mean, there's an ethical concern here. Are we comfortable with the notion that an author whose writing is meant to exhort and instruct Christians who above almost all else elevate truth, to the level of importance, that such a writing could pretend to be written by somebody it's not? There seems to be an ethical concern there that simply anonymous letter doesn't face.
Yeah, good. All right. So, give me the arguments again against Pauline. I want to make notes here, and then we'll cover the reasons why. Looking in depth at this stuff.
Well, and maybe it would behoove us to mention why it is that maybe we're focusing a little more on the pastorals than the other disputed epistles, because I mentioned that 80% of scholars reject the Pauline authorship of the pastorals and of Ephesians, but what's interesting is that the scholars argue that the pastorals are more obviously pseudepigraphal than any of the other disputed letters. So if it could be shown that the evidence against the Pauline authorship of the pastorals is not very good, and that the evidence for their Pauline authorship is good, then that would give us reasons to, all the more reasons to accept the Pauline authorship of the other disputed letters, because presumably the evidence against their authorship wouldn't be as good as as against the pastorals. So that's kind of why I focused on the pastorals in my undergraduate in the article that I pointed you to. And here's another argument that is offered against the Pauline authorship of the pastorals. I mentioned chronology, and I'll give you a specific example. In 1 Timothy 1:3, the author claims to have left Timothy behind at Ephesus while he himself left for Macedonia. Okay. But if you go look at Acts 19:22, it's Paul who stays in Ephesus and sends Timothy with Erastus to Macedonia. So it seems, or it's argued, that the pastoral epistle gets the historical detail here exactly wrong. And also, the author of Titus speaks of a mission to Crete and of himself staying at Nicopolis, and Acts makes no mention of these things. So the argument here is that not only are there events mentioned in the pastorals that don't appear anywhere else in the New Testament, but also when events are mentioned, they're often not just in conflict, but the exact opposite of what is said elsewhere in authentic letters.
So for the chronology, I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with that Titus reference, right? Just because Luke doesn't mention something in Acts doesn't mean Paul didn't do it. No problem there. It seems like there may be a larger concern, though, there with 1 Timothy, if there's a reference. So how would you square that?
I would just simply point out there's no reason, at least that I can think of, for assuming that if an event in Acts and an event mentioned in 1 Timothy, just because they share some of the same names and historical places and stuff, doesn't mean that they're actually talking about the same event. I've been to London, for example, something like 3 times now. So if I were to write about those 3 things, you're going to see me refer to flights to London. You're going to see me mention I've stayed at the same hotel each time I've gone to London. You're going to see a lot of similarities. But if I mention some details in each of the 3 that seem to conflict with one another, you might think maybe he's not contradicting himself. Maybe he's just talking about 3 different events. So I don't see why it couldn't be the case that Acts records a case where Paul does indeed send Timothy and Erastus off to Macedonia while he remains in Ephesus, whereas Paul speaks in 1 Timothy about something like the opposite, where Paul is the one who goes to Ephesus or to Macedonia while leaving Timothy behind at Ephesus.
Yeah, so just 2 different occasions here.
Yeah, I don't see what the problem with that is.
Yeah, it's certainly logically compatible. Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. All right, nice. Okay, so we've got chronology. We talked a little bit about the vocabulary bit. Did we miss anything there?
Well, so I think the one thing we missed is that there are some words in the pastorals that are argued by people like Ehrman to have theological meanings that are not the same meanings they have in other letters. So I'll give you one example. Ehrman argues that in the genuine Pauline letters, the Greek word pistis, meaning faith, refers to a saving trust in Jesus, right? One saving faith in Christ. But he argues that in the pastorals, the Greek word pistis means something like a body of teaching, the body of Christian teaching, the faith. So not one's faith, but the faith. So you do have this argument where the meaning of the vocabulary is different as well.
Because apparently we can't have multiple definitions for the same word?
Right. It's absurd. I mean, all Greek words, just like words in other languages, have a semantic range, and there's no reason to think that would be a problem. But it goes beyond that. Pistis does, in fact, refer to a body of Christian doctrine in the Pauline corpus in places like 1 Corinthians 16:13, 2 Corinthians 13:5, Galatians 1:23, and others. And the same is true of the other words in the pastorals that people like Ehrman argue mean something different. You can find cases where they're used in the same way in the undisputed Pauline corpus.
Good. All right. Why don't we head to our break here? We've got to take a break, Chris. But when we come back, we'll continue looking at the reasons for disputing the Pauline letters and why those reasons seem insufficient. I'm learning quite a bit myself on today's program, and if you're tuning in with us, I hope you are too. We're joined by Chris Date today of Rethinking Hell, and an avid debater and a friend of mine, and he's talking to us about the disputed Pauline letters. Stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
For truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Licona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you want to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com, and click on that Patron tab. And sponsors are folks that, folks like Chris here with Rethinking Hell. They've been supporting the program for a long time now, and we air the advertisement for them. Lots of great resources at their website, rethinkinghell.com. Great articles, and the podcast there. I mean, you've got like 100+ episodes devoted to that subject matter. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, it's sort of been the project that you and Glenn Peoples sort of just undertook, and it sort of took off on its own, hasn't it?
Well, Glenn and I were both invited to be a part of Rethinking Hell when it began, but I wouldn't characterize it as sort of our project. There are others. There's a guy named Joey Deere that's a good friend of mine who actually was instrumental in my becoming convinced of it. Another friend of mine, Ronnie Demler, periodically is involved. Peter Grice, Greg Stump, Darren. Yeah, there's a lot of people involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, now your listeners know why I'm on your show for a third time now, because you have to, because we're paying you to. Yeah, right. No,
we've had a number of multi-appearance guests, but certainly I enjoy having you on, and it's always great. I feel like sometimes I drink from a fire hydrant when listening to you, not just here on the show as well, but sometimes when I tune into some of the other things you're doing. Which
I'm known for speaking probably more quickly than I ought to, yeah.
But hey, as long as people can process the information, I mean, that's, you know.
Well, but that's the question, right? I don't know. Oftentimes they might not be able to. I guess I just sort of assume that in today's technological age, if it's being recorded, they can just turn down the speed and listen. But I really do. That is an area of growth I need to undergo. I need to learn how to speak a little bit more clearly and slowly.
Well, I mean, to me, you're still clear. It's not like you're mumbling over your words. It's just really fast. So.
Yeah, well, you're probably on the higher end of the reading or listening comprehension and IQ scale than perhaps others. I don't know. So
could be. Yeah, it does depend on your audience. But in your formal debates, it seems like a great tactic is just being able to fit in more within the time. So.
Maybe. I think it's a double-edged sword. You do get more evidence in, but at the same time, many of your hearers are going to digest what you say less than they would have if you had said less. So it's always a double-edged sword. You've got to kind of strike the right balance. It's not easy.
True. Before the end of the program today, I want to get into your debate with there's some car horn. How about that?
People you were just telling me about that before we got started.
I want to ask you about a debate you recently had with Leighton Flowers on the Unbelievable program, but I want to save that towards the end. Let me ask you this, though, about your debates. I mean, how long have you been debating? What got you interested in that?
Well, my very first debate was when I was almost 100% convinced of conditionalism, and I guess this would have been back, I don't know, something like 5 years ago. My memory is a little fuzzy. And most of my debates since then have been on the topic of hell, and there have been a number of them, both informal and formal. So I've had, like, for example, an in-person formal debate with a fellow apologist named Phil Fernandez, who's just an awesome guy. But then I've also had informal debates on Unbelievable with people like Al Mohler on the topic of conditionalism. Sorry, not 5 years ago, more like Sorry, I'm looking at my graduation sign above my monitors, which says 2017, but I forgot. Oh wait, it's 2019 now. Yeah. So anyway, more like 7 years. But not long ago, a few years ago, I started dipping my debate toes into other waters, as you mentioned, with Leighton Flowers on the topic of Calvinism, and then I've got an upcoming debate here, just actually in less than 2 weeks in Minneapolis, with a Unitarian named Dale Tuggy. We're going to be debating the deity of Christ. I'll be affirming it. He'll be denying it. I would love for people to come and visit that. So anyway, I'm trying to debate an increasing number of topics because I guess I don't want to be seen as a one-trick pony, and I want people to see that conditionalists are just as committed to the essentials of the faith and to conservative doctrines and things as our traditionalist brothers and sisters in Christ.
Now, you are a computer programmer by trade.
I am.
But this is it seems like your bread and butter stuff. What's your plan here in the future?
It all depends on what the Lord's willing to do. I know I've known for a long time that I wanted to one day, if possible, transition from software to teaching. I'd like to teach at the university or seminary level. And to that end, I started my undergraduate in religion at Liberty University in 2014. In 2017, I began my master's in theology at Fuller, which is where I'm at now. And I'm just a few quarters away from graduating, at which point I hope to go on to a PhD program in the Old Testament at UK school, and then hopefully thereafter eventually get a teaching job. But teaching is a very competitive field, and I don't anticipate getting a job right away.
It doesn't pay as well as the computer programming, I'm sure.
Nowhere near as well as software does. But I don't care about the money. I want to do the teaching. Yeah. But the market is difficult, and so the challenge that I'm going to face is I intend to continue doing full-time software all throughout my PhD, so that when I come out the other end of it, I've still got a job.
Yeah.
And then I can just sort of sit back and relax and let the teaching opportunities
wait
come when they come.
Wait for something to pop up and boom. Yeah. Nice. Great. All right. Let's see here. Oh, before we jump back into the discussion, let me ask you about the Rethinking Hell conferences that you've been putting on.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, we've been putting on conferences since, I think, 2014. We began in Houston, and then we went to Pasadena at Fuller Seminary, and then the next year we went to London, and then the following year we went to Auckland, New Zealand. Last year we went to
if you want to pay my way to go to Auckland, I'd be happy to take you up on that.
Well, since your specialty isn't hell, we probably won't be paying your way to be a plenary speaker.
That's true. Yeah.
And then last year we were at Dallas Fort Worth. This year, and this is coming up in just a few months, August 16th and 17th, we're going to be going to Oklahoma, and we're going to be talking about hell and the gospel. So we're going to be discussing things like how central to the gospel is one particular view of hell over another. What's the relationship between the gospel and hell, things like that. And besides me, we're also going to have somebody you're well acquainted with, Jonathan Pritchett of Trinity College and
Pritchett Prime.
That's right, Prime. Yeah, he's going to be one of the plenary speakers. There's also going to be Marvin Jones, assistant professor of theology and church history at Louisiana College, and then another guy you're familiar with, probably our mutual friend Lindsey Brooks, who was on the apologetics.com radio show. He's going to be one of the plenary speakers as well. So we're going to have an interesting mix of traditionalists in the case of Doctors Jones and Lindsey Brooks, conditionalists in my case, and then someone who's sort of on the fence in the form of Jonathan Pritchett. And then we'll have a few interesting breakout sessions as well, including Dr. James Spiegel, a philosopher who just recently published a book on hell and philosophy. So that'll be interesting as well.
So you said that was August. What are the dates?
August 16 and 17, and it's in Enid, Oklahoma. And if people want to get more details and purchase tickets and things, they can go to rethinkinghellconference.com.
Got it. Great. Well, I'm glad I followed up about the date and location there, because James, who's tuning in, was asking about where in Oklahoma. He lives on the border, so hopefully James Dorsey is able to come to that event. So,
well, I hope to see you there, James. I don't know how far Enid is from wherever he is. I think it's something like an hour or so drive away from Oklahoma City. So it might be a little bit out of the way for some people. Hopefully people are willing to put up with the drive, though.
Yes. All right. Well, let's jump back into our discussion on the disputed. I say Pauline, but you say Pauline.
Potato.
Potato.
Augustine, Augustine.
We had that debate just with Ken Samples.
It's obviously Augustine.
Yeah. Oh, see, I go closer to the Latin. Aurelius Augustinus. So
okay, that's all right.
But at any rate, Samples, I think, had a reply to even my position I hadn't heard of before. I forget what it is. I'll have to go back. I'm stubborn. It's Augustine.
Probably not as stubborn as I am. I'm well known for being stubborn.
Okay, so we've talked about the chronological aspects, the vocabulary to the disputed Pauline letters. What about the content, though? What is it about the content that makes some scholars go, probably not written by Paul?
Yeah, so there are kind of two issues here. One has to do with the ecclesiology of the pastorals. It mentions presbyters and deacons and things like that. And the argument is that hierarchy, that church structure, is a later development, and it's not something that features in the first century. That's not something I covered a lot in my article, but I don't think it's a persuasive argument. The one that I interacted more with is the claim that the false teachings that Paul appears to be trying to combat and encouraging Timothy and Titus to combat, it's argued that it reflects a Gnosticism that isn't popular until the second century. And so if what Paul is disputing in these letters isn't a view that exists until the next century, well, then quite obviously it couldn't be original to Paul.
Again, though, that seems like, why couldn't there be development in his lifetime within a few years? Even let's see, where do folks stand on Galatians?
Galatians is one of the undisputed Pauline epistles.
Right. Okay. Now, in Galatians chapter 1, he says, "If I or anyone else brings a message other than what I delivered to you, let them be an anathema." So Paul is fully aware here of teachings contrary to what he has taught. So there are sort of,
Yeah, but to be fair, to play the disputant's advocate, the issue isn't just that Paul is dealing with issues that he doesn't discuss elsewhere in the epistles. It's that he's dealing with issues that it is argued don't even exist until the second century.
Yeah. So, to that, though, I'd say, well, what if these are sort of the first signs of early development of that view?
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's the thing. The pastorals do not detail these false teachings in such a way that we can be confident they're talking about second century Gnosticism. There are shared elements, but what is talked about in these pastoral epistles is, if anything, sort of a nascent or a nascent Gnosticism or a precursor to Gnosticism that shares some of the same elements but isn't as yet developed. So that seems perfectly consistent with the first century Paul.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the chronology, vocabulary, and content, and while we've sort of addressed why these arguments aren't that good, maybe we should look at some of the arguments in favor of Pauline authorship. So, for example, one of the things a historian might look at is, early attestation. I mean, you've got the document itself, but what about outside the document? Are there folks, and how close are these folks to the first century, who say, yeah, 2 Timothy was written by Paul?
Yeah. So, for example, Polycarp, he's first or second century, and he affirms the Pauline authorship of at least one or more of the the pastoral epistles. Irenaeus of Lyon, who's late second century, I think he also does so as well. So yeah, you have very early attestation that attributes Pauline authorship to these letters. And it's interesting, by the way, in the case of Polycarp and Irenaeus, because if what the author of the pastoral epistles is combating is a later second century developed Gnosticism, why are early second century authors like Polycarp attributing these letters to Paul? That just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. That's
so yeah. No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say it's a weird workaround, and maybe all of a sudden you'd have to have, in order to be consistent, you'd have some scholars saying, well, Polycarp and do you say Irenaeus? They're later, actually, or maybe they're disputed. So all of a sudden everything's just disputed.
Yeah, it's there's no consistency in this argumentation, and I don't mean that as an insult. I'm just saying it seems to me that these kinds of arguments against the Pauline authorship are just they're really reaching, and they're not consistent with one another. Yeah.
So what other reasons might we have for thinking that Paul did in fact write it?
Well, so besides the early Christian witness, which obviously stretches beyond just Polycarp and Irenaeus, there's also the stated recipients of the pastoral letters. And here's what I mean by that. And this is something that Richard Bauckham talks about in his treatment of the pastorals. If the pastorals were written by a second century author to people, but as if it was Paul who was writing to a first century recipient, then there would need to be something in the letters to sort of bridge the gap. In other words, in order to make what Paul is purportedly talking to his first century audience about, to bridge the gap between that and what the real author intends his real recipients to get from it, right? If there, it would be totally irrelevant to the second century context if all the author is doing is talking about things that were relevant to a first century audience. So there needs to be but at the same time, if it's totally irrelevant to the first century, nobody's going to buy that it's actually Paul. So there needs to be something in the text that sort of bridges that gap. And the problem is there's no such thing. The pastorals just don't contain enough detail to bridge that gap. But on the other hand, if the pastorals are truly from Paul to Timothy, as I think they were, Paul doesn't need to go into a lot of details about the issues at hand because Timothy's already familiar with them. So all Paul needs to do is make passing incidental references to them. Timothy's going to know what Paul's talking about, so it makes it perfectly applicable there. But it lacks this bridging the gap mechanism that would make it applicable to a second century audience.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That bridge between the two different time periods. There's got to be a reason for it. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Another one we could turn to, and for here I'm going to turn to somebody that you've kind of bumped heads with a little bit, is Lydia McGrew. I'm not going to touch that dispute between you guys with a 10-foot pole, but she does do good work, I think, on undesigned coincidences between various of the Gospels and epistles and Acts. And I think there are a number of these undesigned coincidences in the pastorals. And the reason this is important is because if pseudepigraphal writings, they, by the very nature of trying to pretend to be an author they're not, they need to make obvious similarities in their writings, similarities to the real ones, right? It's a way of giving the letters verisimilitude, making them appear to be real. Yeah. But there are a number of similarities between the pastorals and other writings that are not obvious. They're just incidental. They appear to be completely unintentional by the author. And I'll give you one example of that.
Yeah, let's take a few. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. We can discuss a few of them. So the author of 2 Timothy writes that his recipient has been taught the scriptures from childhood. This is in 2 Timothy 3:14-15 by his grandmother and mother. And this the Greek phrase here is sacred writings, and it's how Greek-speaking Jews refer to the Old Testament. And it's not used anywhere else in the New Testament, this way of referring to the sacred writings. Okay. And this seems to point to the recipient's Jewish background. Now, this fits really well together with the details recorded in Acts chapter 16, where Timothy is said to be the son of a believing Jewish woman and a Greek man, which would explain why in 2 Timothy the author indicates that his recipient is familiar with the Torah since he was a child, and mentions his grandmother because his grandmother would have been Jewish, but not his father. So here's an example where there's no real point. It's clear that the author doesn't intend to recall Acts chapter 16 when mentioning these details, but yet the details correlate so well together that it seems to be evidence that it is in fact genuine.
Yeah. So let me, if I can try to push back a little.
Please, yeah.
So let me play the disputant's advocate here.
Sure.
So I won't just push back as someone who also thinks it's Pauline. I'll push back as a disputant's advocate. Let's suppose you live in the 2nd century and you're trying to come up with material that you think would be beneficial for the faith community, and you're surveying the relevant New Testament documents. And you see here that Timothy is the son of a Jewish woman. So you decide to now write in this fake letter about his mother and grandmother raising him in the sacred writings. So would that sort of it seems like that might be a defeater, and then you just get into probabilities.
Right, and that is the thing with this particular argument in the overall case, is it's one about probabilities. What is the likelihood that these seemingly incidental, because again, these are not emphatic, real clear parallels. They don't just jump off the page. You have to sort of deduce, okay, he's using language that points implicitly back to a Jewish background, and he mentions only the grandmother and mother, but not the father. That doesn't jump off the page as a connection to Acts chapter 16. It takes a little bit of unpacking. You know what I mean?
It does, yeah.
And then moreover, there are other examples of this too. That if you want to maybe include a link to the show notes to my article, they can see other examples of these undesigned coincidences. And so you've got to. It's an overall cumulative case that's got to be challenged. And I don't think that what you've just offered suffices to do that.
Right. Yeah. You'd have to buy into sort of other background evidence. To get into Bayesian probability theory, so it would require believing in, that the situation arose differently. Well,
and again, you've got to ask yourself: are the readers who this 2nd century author is trying to fool into thinking he's Paul? Are they really going to be piecing apart the language so carefully that they would detect this similarity to Acts 16 and other similar similarities? I don't think it's likely they would.
All right. Before closing off this topic, what about? I mean, how do the pastorals compare to other disputed Pauline letters?
Yeah, this I think is really powerful evidence, and I'm just going to read a short paragraph from this is. Douglas, Tenney, and Silva. Moises Silva is the only one whose first name I'm reminded of right there. But this is a paragraph that they use to summarize the similarities between the pastorals and the other apostles. The three pastorals picture the same kind of person reflected in the others, one who is deeply interested in those whom he addresses, ascribing to God's sovereign grace whatever is good in himself and or in the addressees, and showing wonderful tact in counseling. Again, they were written by a person who is fond of litotes. I don't even know what litotsar, I've forgotten, or understatements, and he gives the example of 2 Timothy 1:8, do not be ashamed, and he cross-references Romans 1:16. He's fond of enumerations, lists of things, as in 1 Timothy 3:1-12, cross-reference Romans 1:29-32. He's comfortable and enjoys plays on words, so you see this in, like puns. You see this in 1 Timothy 6:17, and you can compare that to Philemon 10 and 11. He's fond of appositional phrases. You can see this in 1 Timothy 1:17, and you compare that to Romans 12:1. He's fond of expressions of personal unworthiness in 1 Timothy 1:13 and 15, and you can cross-reference that with 1 Corinthians 15:19. And he's fond of doxologies, and you see that in 1 Timothy 1:17, cross-reference Romans 11:36. So this is just a sampling of some of the many ways in which the language, the structure, the character of Paul that is exhibited by these pastorals is extremely similar to the other undisputed letters.
Yeah, wow. I was getting the debate form of Chris Tate there when he was reading the.
Sure.
But what's really amazing is when you were reading there a paragraph written by someone else, but when you're giving your presentation, I mean, you've got those references just down, and even if you listed the cross references, you've got those down. So that's like I said, you go in prepared, and that's good.
Well, you have to. That's something. And this isn't just on the topic of hell. This is in tons of debates. You see people going in attacking a straw man, and you really need to do your homework.
Yep, and to interpret others charitably. And striving to understand them. I just did a Veracity short video for the first time yesterday. It came out on the Alabama abortion bill, and how there are just a number of misconceptions. And I even pointed to misconceptions on both sides. People just have not read the bill. So if you go read the bill, if you strive for truth, go read the bill, then you can speak accurately about what it's about. So
right.
Yep. Chris, let me thank you for enlightening us here about the disputed Pauline letters, especially the pastorals. Certainly, I've learned some here today, and so thanks for doing that. But before I let you go, for the next few minutes here, I want to pick your brain about the Leighton Flowers debate. And
sure.
That's because for those maybe who don't know, I'm a bit sympathetic to Leighton's view, but I want to say this. I've held to this view for a long time, longer than I think Leighton has even been not a Calvinist. He sort of tailors his ministry as a former Calvinist professor, something like that. At any rate, so you had the chance to go on Brierley's Unbelievable podcast and radio program there in London and throughout England to discuss. Was it on election specifically?
No, it was on meticulous providence specifically.
Okay, meticulous providence. And so what were the two views here then?
Well, so I represented the view that everything that takes place in time is foreordained by God. Another way to think of it is God doesn't know the future because he's able to see what in the future what's going to happen.
He doesn't look down the corridors of time.
Yeah, to use Dr. James White's language. No, I rather he knows what the future is because he's planned it out. So the unfolding of history reflects God's preordained plan of how history should unfold, and the way it unfolds is through the actions of agents, human beings, and others.
Okay.
And then Leighton represented the view that no, God doesn't foreordain all that takes place in time. He does foreordain some of it, but at the very least, he doesn't foreordain all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what were the types of arguments you guys were bringing forward? I mean, what did you get into certain Bible passages?
Well, yeah, we did. In fact, that was the way we structured it. Justin gave me 3 texts to present my positive case, and then Leighton 3 texts to present his. And 2 of mine were very common ones. Genesis 50, where Joseph says, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good," and in Acts 4, where the church praises God for sovereignly foreordaining everything that Herod. So forth. And then, but the one that I went in wanting to discuss the most, and this is something that I've been considering doing in my PhD, there seem to be a number of Old Testament historical narratives that don't explicitly attribute this kind of providence to God, but seem to imply it. So I discussed the issue of Abraham's servant at the well of Nahor, where he finds a wife for Abraham's son, and just the servant's prayer at the well is answered at precisely the time and in precisely the way that he prayed it, in such a way that I don't think can be explained apart from all of the thousands of human decisions and actions that would have had to have taken place in precisely the way they did and at the time they did in order to make that prayer happen
So let me ask you this, and let me say too, I would be honored to have a dialogue or even a formal debate with you on this someday.
You'd probably kick my butt.
But so you talked about the prayer there with Abraham. So, but would that mean that God is meticulously determining what someone's doing halfway across the world?
That particular case, maybe not. Although, there is this sort of concept of the butterfly effect, right? That if something happens somewhere around the world, it's going to the effects of it are going to ripple outward.
Yeah.
And I think it's at least conceivable that there are even beyond Nahor actions and decisions that would have had to have taken place in the way they did for what happened there to happen. But even if not, I'm only saying this is one example of myriad examples in the Old Testament where this couldn't play out the way it did unless everything happened in exactly the way that it did.
So is your argument sort of a cumulative case, like looking at these different Bible verses, or would you say it's more deductive approach?
Well, it's certainly not deductive, right? I mean, deductive has a very specific meaning in argumentation. I would say it's inductive. It's an inference to the best explanation.
Yeah.
You see these events taking place in the Old Testament that I think seem to indicate that God has foreordained thousands of human decisions and actions in order to make it happen. Then you've got a number of passages in which God seems to say, like I direct the heart of the king wherever I wish, or
the proverb about a man, the Lord directs his steps or something like that.
Yeah, although I think that one's a little bit more ambiguous.
Yeah,
exactly. So I mean, it's a cumulative case of the first thing I mentioned, of specific statements about God lifting up kings and taking them down, and it just seems that when you put all these pieces together, along with explicit statements like Genesis 50 and Acts 4 and others, it just seems like the overall picture is one in which the biblical authors do in fact think that history is completely foreordained. And however we understand that in relationship to freedom and responsibility and stuff, I think we need to work that out. But I'm not comfortable sort of working out the philosophy and then foisting that upon the Bible, which is what I think people who don't hold to Calvinism inevitably do. That doesn't mean I'm trying to be insulting toward you, but
right. Hey, it's a two-way street. I think that's for what's happening with the other camp.
There you go. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Good. Well, I haven't had the chance yet. I've just had an extremely busy year for me, but I'll have to go back and listen to that discussion on meticulous providence.
I'm sure you'll side with Leighton. But the good thing about conversations like the one you and I are having right now, the one that Leighton and I had, is that and the ones that like James White has with Dr. Michael Brown, it demonstrates that we as Calvinists and as non-Calvinists, we can have these kinds of conversations in a loving and respectful and friendly way.
Amen.
And we don't need to cut at each other's throats and claw at each other the way that often some people on both sides of the debate seem to do.
Yep. Yeah, it's a shame when that happens. People can get passionate about this stuff, but you have to keep that passion in check when realizing that you're dealing with people. This is about relationships. Right. And I was just giving a presentation at to I think there were 6th and 7th graders. I was invited by a local school, private Christian school, and I was talking about Paul's demolishing arguments, 2 Corinthians 10:5, and the illustration I was using was Marvel, the Hulk smash. So you want to Hulk smash arguments, but you don't want to Hulk smash people.
That's right.
So there's a difference there. So.
Well, and we need to remember that what Jesus said will tell the world that we are truly his is that we love one another. Yep. So if we're not showing love to one another in the way that we discuss our differences, we're telling the world that we're not really Christ's followers.
Yep. Actions are important.
That's right.
Chris, thank you so much. Great to speak with you. We'll have to, schedule another time in the future. You can come on and chat with us about whatever you'd like. This is so fun. I like learning from you, and it's really a pleasure to have you on.
I always enjoy talking with you as well. I have the utmost of respect for you, and maybe one of these days we'll get to see each other in person for once.
Yeah. Keep me posted. I try to go to the annual EPS conference. I don't know if you try to get over that way.
It's a little too far. When the day comes where they have the topic of hell and make me a plenary speaker, then maybe I'll go.
There you go. All right. God bless you, Chris. We'll be in touch.
You as well. Thanks, Kurt. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, well, that does it for the program today. On next week's episode, I believe we have scheduled Neil Shenvi, who's going to be talking about critical theory. I'll have to double-check our schedule, though, on that. But that should be an exciting topic, getting a little bit more into political philosophy and looking at social issues. And if you did watch the VH short that we put out yesterday, hopefully there's more of that coming. And if you want to see more of those, to make those feasible to be producing on a regular basis, I'd like to see if you'd consider supporting our program. You can do so by visiting veracityhill.com and clicking on that Patron tab. Defenders Media is doing a new donor drive, and we as part of the organization are participating in that. So I'm looking to have new folks come and join our grassroots army of donors. So even if it's $5 or $10 a month, we would love to have you as part of our support base for our ministry work. So please, thank you for your thoughtful consideration. Okay, well, I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and now Reasons to Believe, which I forgot to add to the image, but we'll do that for sure for next week. Thank you for all of those organizations, the partnerships that they've had with us, and happy to promote their work and think highly of them as well. I think they all do great work. So thank you to the technical producer, Chris, for his fine work week in, week out. Thank you, Chris. And to our guest, Chris Date, again, an avid debater, a thoughtful gentleman, and a kind Christian brother. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.